Okay, class, let's start. Today we'll be talking about international trade, chapter 13. In this chapter, what are we gonna do? Our objective is explain the importance of international trade and why nation trade with each other. Explain why nations import certain goods even though they can be made more cheaply at the home. Explain how the gain from the trade are divided between the trading partners. And also will describe why some group win and other lose as result of free trade and explore the trade restrictions. And then we identify some argument against a free trade. Well, the trend in the world trade and the GDP since 1970 up to 2000, if you notice, it keep increasing amount for the world of the GDP. So the world trade has improved the world of the GDP indirectly. We noticed in the old days when the world trade was limited, we had some countries going through starvation, and these countries disappeared from the list of the starvation is for many reasons, but one of the reasons is the improve of the technology plus the availabilities of the trade. Now, specialization and trade. The factor it's an advantage in a production that comes from a better skill, equipment, or other resources. So let's assume that I usually cut 10 trees a day and my neighbor sew 5 shirts a day. I get an equipment like a chainsaw and I start cutting 20 trees a day. And I have a certain time limitation. So with that, I cut 20 trees using a new technology, improved technologies. Now, if I choose to sew a t-shirt for myself, might take an amount of time, which is that amount of time can be um, spent cutting trees. So one t-shirt probably will cost me cutting 5 trees, chainsaw. Now, if my neighbor he's really good in sewing t-shirts, so and he's looking for trees, woods. I might trade two trees with a one t-shirt of his because then I will have an excess of a trees in a t-shirt because if I'm gonna sew the t-shirt, I'm gonna have to lose 5 trees. But now I trade 2 trees with a one t-shirt, so I have another 3 extra trees in a t-shirt. So the advantage in production that comes from a better skills, equipment, or other resources. The theory of absolute advantage is nations like firms and individuals should specialize in producing goods and services for which they have advantage. They should trade for goods and services for which they do not enjoy the advantage. Another example, if we're looking at trading oils and woods between Canada and Saudi Arabia. Exporting oil, getting oil out of the ground, cost Saudi Arabia is $5 and cost Canada around $35. So it's cheaper for Saudis to export the oil to get the oil out of the the ground, from under the ground. On the other hand, it is the weather in Canada makes it lots of trees, so there's lots of trees can be cut and changed to wood. So it is wiser for Canada to purchase to get oil in return, gives them give Saudi Arabia woods because Saudi Arabia needs that woods. So it's basically is you know they should trade of good and service in which they do enjoy the advantage. The advantage of Saudi Arabia is to produce oil because it costs them $5 a barrel, Canada 35, and Canada should produce woods from the trees because is lots of trees in Canada. Now let's look at the beer. Let's say Fredonia can produce 4 beer or 1 wine, and then you have a Liberland, which is can produce 3 beer or 4 wine. Here, which country should be specializing in which product? And the answer is Fredonia should be specializing in beer because they can produce 4 beer instead of 1 wine. And Liberland should be specialized in wine because they can produce 4 wine instead of 3 beer. So suppose the initially the working population of each country is 20 million. And with the 10 million working in each industry. So Fredonia has 10 million working in beer and 10 million working in wine. And Liberland has 10 million working in beer and 10 million working in wine. What is the total output in this case? We notice that Fredonia can produce 40 millions of beer and 10 millions of 10 multiplied by 1, 4 multiplied by 10. And Liberland can produce 30 million of beer and 40 million of wine. So the totals is if we these two countries add together is going to be producing 70 million beer and 50 million wine. Not bad number. Now, suppose that each country decide to specialize in the production in which it has advantage. What will be the total output of product and what are the gain from trade? So Fredonia cancel the wine and they go all the 20 million producing beer. And Liberland canceled producing the beer and they go specialize in wine. So in this case, what we have is Fredonia produced, because Fredonia produced 80 million. So there is a 20 million people multiplied by 4, 80 million, and Liberland will produce 80 millions of wine. So in this case, instead of having 70, now we have 80 million beer, which is they gain both of them together 10 million beer. And instead of 50 wine, now they have 80 wine and they gain 30 million more bottle of these two countries united with each other. So specialization and trade, the theory of comparative advantage, the advantage that comes from producing something at the lower opportunity cost than others are able to do. An example we brought in earlier is Saudi Arabia can produce a barrel of oil at $5, yet Canada can produce it at $35. So it's a better Saudi Arabia export oil to Canada. On return, because too many, lots of trees, so it's better Canada produce tree woods and export it to Saudi Arabia because it's cheaper for them to do that. Now, when we are looking at an example, let's look at for example, the US example versus Philippines. Let's assume that United States can produce 4 wheats or 4 beans. And then we have Philippines who can produce 1 wheat or 3 beans. Each country has a trade-off opportunity cost for each item it's produced. So if they stop, USA stop producing 4 wheat, they will end up producing 4 beans. And if they stop producing 4 beans, they end up producing 4 wheat. That's what you call opportunity cost. In in other word, is United States can for 4 wheats, for each wheat they produce, they have to sacrifice 1 bean. Or for each bean they produce, they have to sacrifice 1 wheat. On other hand, in Philippines, for each wheat they produce, we said it might be replaced by 3. In other words, for if they sacrifice 1 wheat, they end up producing 3 beans, and 1/3 of the wheat. If they produce 1 bean, they have to sacrifice 1/3 of the wheat. So the US is comparatively better at making the wheat because one by one. It gives up one beans while Philippines has to give up 3 wheats. Give up 3 beans. Yes. So it gives up 1 beans while Philippines gives up 3. So opportunity cost production is means that 1 wheat equal with 1 bean, or 1 bean equal with a 1 wheat, or the 1 wheat of, if the Philippine produce, they have to sacrifice the opportunity cost or sacrifice the 3 beans. And if they decide to produce 1 bean, they have to sacrifice only 1/3 of the wheat. So the Philippines is comparatively better at beans. So it gives up 1/3 of the wheat while the US has to give up one. So both can trade, or both can be better off specializing in with a trade. In other words, in the production without a trade, suppose that United States produce at C while the Philippines produce at B, and there is no trade. What we have United States produce 240 million of wheat and 160 million of beans. And Philippines produce 80 on wheat and 60 beans. Let's assume the quality is similar and there is no preference. So it's basically what we have here. We have 240 plus 80 equal with a 320 wheat. So if they are united, it becomes one country. What will happen? 240 plus 80 is 360 wheat. 240 plus 80. And to get without a trading, 160 beans plus 60 beans, 220 beans. And if they do a trade-off and they say, okay, you USA cancel producing the beans and just focus on wheat, and you Philippine cancel the wheat and focus on beans, we're going to end up with a 400 because of the opportunity cost and 300 here. And it's going to be the total for both countries is 400 wheats and 300 beans. So here would we have 80 more wheat and 80 more beans from the previous case, which is we saw 220 and 320. So this is if they are specializing in certain thing and they start trading. Now, other politics goes in involved with it. For example, the quality of good, that's economics. But a politician might say wheat could be a very crucial, so they should not stop producing wheat even if they're not specializing. That's an exception. We had a case in Saudi Arabia during King Faisal with Kissinger's where he was planning to produce wheat in Saudi Arabia, and the American trying to tell him just specialize in oil and we will specialize in producing wheat. But he was saying no, because what if you don't give us the wheat? What will happen to us? The oil is not going to be expired, but we're going to go hunger. So it was a quiet, a few trip discussions, and Kissinger got angry in that time, and he made an announcement saying, "Well, we're going to stop when they stop the wheat and let them eat their oil." And you know, um, later on, there is a doubt that Kissinger was of the people who was involved in assassinating King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. That's a doubt. I mean, not a doubt. There is people were pointing finger at this issue because they had total disagreement with each other. Now, in any way, so the term of trade is basically, sorry, the term of trade is basically it's the average price of a country export compared with the price of import. So what's the average price of export compared to the average price of import of that goods? Multiply by percentage. A good example, let's say uh, salmon, fish, and diva. And Canadians are exporting salmon fish and importing diva. Now, in this case, let's assume that Canada export 5 salmon each at 20, and in return they get a diva, which is 100. Suddenly, the fish price goes higher, so now they are producing same 5, but now the total is 200, so they can buy 2 diva. And if they stay their price same, but diva gets cheaper, they still can buy 2. So in either case, the second case or the third case, the term of trade have moved in the favor that it's Canada now gets more import of the same amount of export. So just like you traded 10 barrels for 1 tree, and then suddenly you can trade the same 10 barrels to 2 trees, or you your trees you can trade instead of um, 10 barrels, you trade only 5 barrels for the tree. So whether your price of your good goes up or the price of others goes down, it's the both makes it beneficial for you as amount of export. Now we go back to the US case, which is bean versus wheat. Let's assume in the numbers, we show it in the numbers that how this thing is going to work. So let's assume there is no trade. And if there is no trade, then Philippines produce 60 beans and export no trade, so they produce with the 60. And also, they produce 80 wheat and no export, so they can consume the 80 wheat. So here they consume 60 and 80. Same thing with the US. Let's assume they produce 160 beans and they consume the 160 beans and produce 240 and then consume 100, 240. Let's assume they consume everything. But let's see what if they are getting specialized in the trade. So in this case, Philippine will end up producing only beans, which is they're going to produce 300 based on the assumption that we took in the previous two slides. And the beans exported is a 240 because all they need is a 60. So the excess demand, they can export it. On the other hand, because they're not producing wheat, they have to end up importing wheat from, say, USA. So in this case, what will happen is they will gain 80 wheats because they are consuming 120 80 wheat with their, producing of 60, 300 beans. And the same thing, USA, if not producing any beans, but they have to consume 240, but in the same time, they're producing a 400 wheat and they consume only 120, they have an excess of 280 that can be traded. So they gain 80 beans in this case and 40 wheats. The 40 wheat because they used to consume 240, now they consume 280. So it's a 40 wheat. And they used to consume 160 after the trade, they consume 240, which is that makes it 80 beans. So we see after the trade, the both are better off. Philippine in the wheat better off, and they managed to export their excess of beans. And USA in the wheat and the beans better off. If we look at our graph, we see that in the beginning, they before the trade, USA was producing at this level, one by one, and then because of that, after the trade, they were producing at this level when it comes to the wheat. On the other hand, before the trade, the quantity of wheat per day they were producing at this level, the Philippine, versus the quantity of beans. But then they started producing at this level versus the quantity of the bean. So the first one, you notice here, they were producing for each one is a 1. So if they sacrifice 1, then they go to this. Sacrifice 2, they add 80. So they are going, for example, from reducing their sacrifice before the trade. Let's see. So they sacrifice here 80 and they gain 80. That's before the trade. So they sacrifice 80 and they gain 80 beans. And in this case, all they have to do is really they sacrifice not an 80, they sacrifice 50 and they gain 80. So after the trade there is a shift out happening to them. It's the same thing with after the trade, there is a shift out of production for them. So there is a better situation for Philippines also. Now, so what's the advantage of free trade in general? Well, we have a lower price as a result of a lower cost of production. And the best example, we see that the trade between Canada and Saudi Arabia, cost of production of 1 barrel of oil is $5, and it's a better than Canadian producing oil. And cost of production of 1 ton of wheat, a ton of wood is much, much cheaper than cost of production of ton of wood in Saudi Arabia. So the Canadians are better off to export wood, and Saudis are better off to export oil. In both cases, there would be higher income because they become specialized at their field, and also because the cost is reduced. When the cost, reduced, that means higher income, a greater variety and quality of product because these people will be specialized in their field. So, for example, USA, which is good in producing wheat, they would be specialized in wheat, better variety, better product quality, and beans is produced by Philippines. It also will increase the competition because you're creating a free trade, so you have to compete with the external resources, which is could be better or cheaper than you, so increase the competitions for the locals. Now, another example, well, if we're looking at demand and supply side without a free trade, for example, in France, they consume lots of wine on one product now, not a two different product like a wheat and beans or woods and oil. Now it's a one product, and let's assume that France consume more wine. What makes it, because they consume more wine, the production is higher, so the cost is lower, so the price of wine is cheaper. On the other hand, because Germany is consuming less wine here, what will happen? The production is lower, the cost is higher for the suppliers, so the price is higher. So there is an excess, there is cheaper wine in France versus more expensive wine in US, in Germany, sorry. Let's say they do the export with a free trade. Some of the France surplus or their export excess wine, they can send it to Germany, which is they import, which is they have shortage, let's assume. And what will happen is eventually, that the in Germany, the supply will shift out at a lower price, and there is an import of 6 units, more products, and more products of the wine is make the price cheaper. Now in the US, in France, they have an excess that they can export it to them, although the price a little bit goes higher. So who's winner and who's loser in this case? If we have one product and we assume that, and it is only one product, but if it's a different product, like Philippine and US case is wheat and beans, is different. Here we have one product. In this case, the winners is domestic German consumers, the people in Germany. They get more product choices now. They can have German wine or a French wine, and because there is more supply, the price is cheaper. The other winner is the producers, the suppliers in the France, because now they can produce for the domestic consumption and for the export. And because in Germany the price is more expensive, so they can get a higher price outside also. The loser side is the foreigner consumer, the French people, because now the amount that supply of wine is went down, and when it went down, the price goes higher. And the other side is the domestic producer in Germany, because now they have a cheaper wine coming from France. So the price got lower. And also, there's more competition. So they have to improve on their wine. So these are the winners and the losers. The first part is the German consumers are winners, and the French producers. The loser side is the French consumer, because the price went high, and the German producers. So that's why you have sometimes what you call a trade protection. And the types of trade protection, you have the import quota, you have something called tariffs, you have the currency exchange control, you have the bureaus of regulations, and voluntary export restriction. Import quota is about saying you're not allowed to import more than 100 tons to Canada from USA. The tariffs is another way of taxes. Is that when you import product that you have to pay a tariffs on them. The currency exchange is about, you can you to buy foreigner goods, you have to pay for them. So when the government says you cannot buy more certain US dollars, certain amount of US dollars, that's another way. Or they just lower the currency exchange, like making the Canadian dollar much cheaper, so you cannot really buy American wine and compete. And there is rules and regulation, bureaucratic regulation, and voluntary export restriction. We'll talk about each one of them. And the quota is another word, is a limited impose on a production or a sales of a product. So then they asking people to certain level to produce a limited a limit imposed on a production or a sales of a product. Protectionism, the economic policy of protecting domestic producers by restricting the import of foreign products. So they might have, putting some rules that makes it difficult to import a foreigner products. So when you import quota raise the prices. And we said import quota or quota in general, a limited impose on a production or the sales of a product. So there is an import quota on the products coming. What's happened here is, let's say they're producing internal and external together is 100, 50 from outside, 50 inside. Suddenly they said you're not allowed to bring more than 30. So it becomes the total available is 80. So what's happened here is there was a shift in the supply. And what's happened here is it limits these things and increases the prices. So import quota rise the prices, lower the imports, and increase the domestic production. And why they increase the domestic production? Suddenly there is an excess demand of 80. From 100 it becomes 80. Excess demand of 20. So the local start producing more to satisfy this excess demand. On the tariff is a tax or a duty on the import. They put it on the import. In the case of currency exchange is when the government restrictions limiting the amount of foreigner currency that can be obtained. So you're not allowed to get more than $100,000. So all you can buy is with it $100,000 of good and bring it in. The other option, what they do, they lower their currency values. The effect of tariffs raise the prices, lower the import. So how it raise the prices? So you bring in something at $10, but there is a tariff of $2 on it, becomes at $12. And then when you sell it, you have to sell it and make a profit. And let's say you sell it $14 because you wanted to make $2 profit. If there is no tariff, you bring in something $10, you sell it to $12, you're making $2. But if there is a tariff, you bring in something $10, you pay tariff $2, so it becomes like your cost is at $12 and you're selling it at $14. So tariff is raise the price, will lower the imports anyway because the demand for a local for consumption of foreign products because it's more expensive will go down and will increase the domestic production, makes the domestic produce more because there is a more demand now, excess of demand, and that also will increase the tax and revenue for the government in general. Now there is other trade restrictions and rules that makes it hard for foreign products to enter the country or require them to be modified before entering. So double labeling, certain modifications, it makes it more expensive. That's in the goods. In the service, they might be putting some kind of, as a lawyer in India or a doctor in India should come and write the exams, which is tough to use it. These are restrictions. And then there is what you call VER, or where is a voluntary export restriction. It's an agreement by an exporting country to restrict the amount of its export to another country. So there is in the NAFTA there is an agreement that there is certain quotas, certain amount that Canada can export to USA, and USA can export to Canada. So, what's the argument against a free trade? Why should we not having a free trade? We spoke earlier about, and you guys made a case, I think, about a free trade and how the situation could be the negative side. But here's more about it. It's that it's the strategy of industry argument is a country's strategic industry may be offered protection so the country does not become dependent on foreign manufacturing. So this is what was taking Faisal in mind is he had talking about that he wants to produce wheat because he wants to create a protection for his own people. On the other hand, Kissinger was talking about not producing wheat and focusing on oil because he wants to run at trade efficiencies. The second thing, the infant industry argument, the certain infant industry may be protected until they are sufficiently mature to take on a foreigner competition. And this is we see sometimes in European Union a lot. Here is some industry, European Union, what they did, they asked Hungary to put quota on the imports or the duties so they can sustain their local production and get strong enough to compete with the rest of European Union. They do with the smaller countries or less efficient countries until they can stand on their feet and become more competitive with other product with other countries. And there is another one, which is a cultural identity argument. You can hear it a lot from the older peoples, is that now we eat McDonald's, we wear jeans, we listen to West music. So the free trade brings the mass production and standardization, Americanization between, if there is a free trade between US and India, for example. So which may harm the importing country's sense of identity. And then you have the environmental and labor standards. And the environment might, be producing in a country where there are less restriction on the environment and might hurt the environment, or there is a sweatshop somewhere and it's cheaper, so they can put this restriction not to bring in these things from overseas. So overall, what we picked up from this chapter 13, the theory of absolute and competitive advantage. The gain from trade stems from the difference in opportunity cost and of production. We spoke about trees versus oil in Saudi Arabia. I cut the trees, my neighbor does t-shirts, or beans and wheat between Philippines and US. These are all examples that we will. And we spoke how the gain from the trade are divided. There are winery winners and losers when the free trade is introduced. Trade restriction and argument against, we spoke about them the last thing. Thank you.